So we're at our Tree Haven facility in Tomahawk, Wisconsin, and this is part of a grouse demo. And so what I'm going to do is start right at this spot first. This is what I consider hen habitat. So when you're looking at grouse hens generally like to find places in the woods where they can butt up against dead trees or living trees or boulders so that they've got about 30 foot of clear view in front of them. And then in the surrounding area that they've got escape cover that's relatively dense outside of that 30 foot area. And so what we got here is two areas that I consider pretty good hen cover. The first is this. So we have a nice dead tree, we have a hollow against it. So a grouse hen can go in there and lay her eggs. The same thing with this tree over here. And then she's got about 30 foot of clear vision. So she's kind of protected from predators. She's nestled in there, it's going to blend really well, and they won't see her. The chick habitat's right on the other side of the trail, so literally 100 foot away. So our hen comes in, she lays her eggs, usually lay up to maybe 15 eggs, and she'll sit there and hatch them. As soon as they're hatched, she takes them to essentially cover, and we'll cover what those characteristics are in a minute. But in order to do that, ideally the proximity is very close. That means if you have these pockets of reserve, so this is several acres of aspen reserve adjacent to young aspen coppice, you've got relatively close proximity. The hens can nest here. They can get their chicks over there because as chicks, we have a wildlife specialist over here who is fond of calling them potato chips with legs. But that's really true about them. Everything eats them. They have avian predators, they have ground predators, a wide range of things eat them. They're literally potato chips with legs. And so this is the starting point. Now, grouse hens will use a wide range of conditions. They prefer something like 30-year-old aspen or older. They like that area of the understory just to be completely open for at least 30 feet out. They do like dense cover to escape to other than that. But they'll use dead trees, boulders, or they'll use living trees. They're not particular about the nest. They don't do a whole lot of nest production. They basically just put their butts up against the trees. And so that's nest cover. So grouse is really one of the charismatic birds that we have in northern Wisconsin. And through the years, population has varied quite a bit. We're still doing okay in this part of the state population-wise. A lot of the southwestern part of the state used to have really heavy numbers, and just the habitat is not in place right now to support it. This funding that was used for this project, the timber sales themselves cash flowed. But the funding that was used for the educational side of this was provided by Young Forest Initiative, was provided by Rough Grouse Society. Both of those entities are basically making a strong effort to promote these birds that require young forest. Rough grouse is a bird that requires a high diversity of habitat. There are other species that require more extensive young forests. Rough grouse is much more strong preference for a high diversity condition. But other birds like golden-winged warbler are ones that need a little bit more extensive open areas. And so those organizations are putting funding into these projects in an effort to basically promote management that favors these species. Wisconsin, over the last 100 years, we've had a regrowth after the big cutover. And some of our species that have deteriorated in that time, is actually, one of them has been aspen. Even though it's one of the most voluminous timber products coming out of the state right now, it's actually in long-term decline because as our forests have aged, they're shorter-lived species. They're beginning to die off. A lot of management is becoming more attentive to the full overstory condition where there's essentially a real desire to keep an overstory. As a consequence, people are managing with some form of single tree selection. And what that translates to is our aspen is slowly declining across a large range. So efforts to keep that on the landscape are pretty important for many of our wildlife species. And that's where groups like Rough Grouse Society and Young Forest Initiative come into play. So I want to put this in kind of a natural history of grouse context, but also looking at the commercial aspect of doing this harvest. Grouse hen, I need intact overstory, reasonably dense with escape cover near it. So that can be 30-year or older aspen. As soon as the chicks are born, I need this 5 to 15-year, ideally aspen. It can be other species, but aspen works really well because you can see how copiously it resprouts. And it usually resprouts in combination with berry brush. So that combination of the berry brush, the hazelnut, in the understory, and then the overstory of the aspen gets us our chick food. As they go through summer, they use any food resource they can utilize, particularly if they have hard mast and soft mast, they utilize those. Once they go into winter, you're going to need habitat that ideally will give them buds on bigger trees. So those are going to be 30-year-old plus trees, ideally aspen and birch, because those have very nutritious flower buds. And what that leads into is a full life cycle of this for the aspen. This stage right here is just where it's starting to get interesting. None of it's commercial yet. And ideally, while there are some people that thin this in this region, this can be left to grow out to 30 to 50 years. At that point, it's actually commercial. And if you're looking in the lake states, a lot of this goes out as pulpwood. There's also a bulk market for pallet material, if it's bigger material. So at 30 to 50 years, depending on the site quality, it now becomes commercial. And what's really cool about these, some of these stands are actually fairly high volume. They're usually a coppice, so you're cutting most everything on the site, meaning it's a very efficient harvest. And so commercially, you can get this done. It's going to be about another 20 to 30 years from this age. And if you can sequence it so you always have mature timber on the site, every 10 to 15 years, you have a commercial harvest happening on the site. You're not actually paying money to get this work done. You are getting money for this harvest. And that allows you to invest money in things like seeding the roads or other activities, planting soft mass material, landings, things of that nature that work really well for grouse habitat. And so if I look at this it really fits an area that has a pulp market because a lot of this material is relatively small. It's not a high density wood, but it's actually easy to pulp. And so it's utilized as a hardwood component of these pulp mixes. It can be cut in the form of a coppice, so it's a relatively simple cut. You basically go in and cut everything. In this condition, this was a coppice with reserves, and the reserves were predominantly long-lived conifers like red and white pine. And in other areas of the state, it very well could be reserving things like white oak. They have a longer rotation length, and they provide hard mast within the setting. And that's kind of how this fits in the whole life cycle with aspen. A staggered harvest so that every 10 or 15 years you have different areas in young habitat, figuring a rotation of between 30 to 50 years depending on the site quality, and constantly going in and having all ranges of ages. So you have the wintering habitat for them to bud off of the trees, eating the buds, that you have the nesting habitat in the 30-year-old plus aspen, and that you have that constant range of 5 to 15-year-old aspen moving through for the chicks. And it can all be done commercially. That's what's beautiful about the system. We have a market for this product in this region. It's relatively easy to manage, and you can make money on it. It's truly a win-win situation. So if you're a young grouse, a little chick with following mom, you're not very tall. In ideal world, you've got a 2-layered cover over top of you. Layer number 1 being these brambles. So got a lot of blackberry, and then we also got dewberry growing in here, as well as the hazelnut. And then over top of that, you got a second layer, like this aspen sprouts. So if you can look behind us, if you're an avian predator, it is really hard to follow grouse chicks when you've got both this to work with and this to work with. That 2-layered cover is really good cover. So you started out, so they just hatched. We got 15 chicks. And luckily, right across the road was the nesting cover for the hen. She brought her chicks right over here, so they had to go 100 feet. So we didn't lose any yet, thankfully. And now they need to go through here. The first month to 6 weeks, they eat really, really heavily on insects. That protein and fat is what they need to actually grow. And so the insects, they get in here, and there's enough light that all of the forbs and legumes growing down at ground level, as well as the berry brush, is feeding insects, and those insects feed the birds. So this bugging habitat is good foraging habitat for the chicks, but it's got the built-in protection from the 2-layered cover. This aspen was cut in 2015, so it's 5 years old right now. And there's a fair amount of deer browse up here. So the first year, there was a fair amount of browse pressure. It took it about 3 years to where it actually got above the deer. And once it got above the deer, you know, this is about 15 feet tall now. From about 5 years to about 15 years after coppice is when these things are the ideal for grouse chicks. So in an ideal world, you'll stagger cuts. About every 10 years, you'll have another cut, maybe every 15 years. Every 10 years, you have this next cut, and that next cut allows it to grow up 5 years. And when this stuff is declining, the next stuff is actually starting to hit its prime. So this cut right here happened 5 years ago. The cut adjacent to it happened 11 years ago. So what we've now got is an area that's absolutely perfect habitat right now. So it's 11 years old, it's just perfect. It's got that 2-layered structure, but the overstory of the aspen's getting dense enough that it's starting to shade out the berry brush. So roughly when it hits 15 to 20 years, it's adequately shaded over top that berry brush in the underneath stops really functioning very well as good habitat. There's not a lot of insect habitat, and that leaves the grouse chicks much more open to depredation. So ideally, you have, once you enter that 20-year-old plus age group, you've got some 5 to 15-year-old age group to fill the gap. That means if you're trying to plan this operationally, you go into mature aspen and you cut, let's say, 1/4 of the property at one stand entry. You leave the rest of it there to grow. 10 years later, you cut another 1/4, and 10 years later, another 1/4. So you get these staggered cuts so that through time, you have perpetually good hen habitat for the hens. So you have some of the older 30 years and older aspen. And then you've got the habitat for these chicks as well. And that's that 5 to 15-year-old resprout. And ideally, that's what you're generating. And what you see in this is almost perfect. This is like probably about the first year that it's moving into its really, really happy zone. Was a little bit too open a couple of years ago. Still got the really happy berry brush. Got the closing canopy of the aspen, but not so closed that it's shading out the understory. And that is almost perfect for grouse chicks. Okay, so this portion of the stand was cut 11 years ago. And some of the things to notice, you still have some of that structure, some of that 2-tiered structure, but you can see that most of the brushier species, most of the berry brush is declining. This is still very functional grouse chick habitat, but it's on the decline. Still good, but in 5 years, you can already tell that it's pretty much on its way out. And it's at this stage right now where a lot of stems are dying. And that's fine. It needs to happen in order for this aspen stand to mature. But at this stage, it's at the end of where it's going to be good chick habitat. Still okay for a few years. And it's a little premature for where it's going to be wintering habitat for the adults. So for that first 6 weeks, so the hens hatch their eggs, they bring the chicks into this kind of habitat. In that time, they're going through immense mortality. They might start with 15, and about 6 weeks later, they might have only 5 or 6 or even none of their chicks left. But let's say 5 or 6. And they've started to get much larger. And then they start to vary a lot in what they eat. You'll see them eat all kinds of stuff. They'll eat flower buds. They'll eat soft mass. So the berries, they will hit those very heavily. As they go later in the year, they start hitting the hazelnuts. They start hitting the oak, if there's oak in the area, any hard mast as well as soft mast. When you get to this time period that we're in right now, a lot of the ready food resources have actually been utilized. And from this window on, they switch to feeding heavily on catkins and buds. And that's when they start using a little bit older aspen. So minimum 30 years old, needs to be stuff that's actually stable enough for them to be up in the crowns. And they'll actually work in the tops of the trees and eat the flower buds out of the trees. And that's what they eat for most of the winter. For a grouse, it's actually a pretty rough time when it's like it is right now. So we have very shallow snow. We have relatively limited food source. This is moving out of what was the happy time of year into what is the much more Spartan time of year. And they're going to be feeding heavily on flower buds all winter long. You know, catkins on flower buds from aspen, etc. And ideally, they have to snow roost. So if they do roost in trees, at least they have to have some conifers if they're going to really be protective with thermal cover. But if they snow roost, which means they fly into snow on the ground, they cover themselves with the snow and they burn about 25% of the energy they would if they were roosting in spruce trees. And that means it's a very good way to hold on to those grams of fat that they need to hold on to make it through winter. This condition, the ground is nice and frozen. It's been cold for an extended period of time, but the snow is like that deep. Ideally, a good foot of snow, ideally fluffy snow, is really what they prefer, because they can fly into it, make a little depression in the snow, and stay under it like a blanket. And so at this point, this stand is leaving the stage where it's good for the chicks, but it's not mature enough yet that it's good winter food. Okay, so this is the most recent cut in the grouse demonstration unit. If you look over to that side, you can see some aspen resprout. That's aspen resprout from a previous harvest here. It's been expanded out. You can expect these trees to resprout roughly 2 tree heights away. So you've got 60 to 80 feet where you should have resprout. We have the same thing to the other side of the cut. Essentially existing aspen resprout, been expanded out. You got a fair amount of reserve trees kept on this particular property, and that's mostly for aesthetics reasons. And in the surrounding area, we can expect most of the open ground in here to resprout to aspen and red maple. Now we do have some balsam fir seedlings here. We'd expect those to come in as well. And there may be some small pine seedlings on site that will grow up pretty effectively. They're not very competitive against the aspen, but they usually do persist. And there's also a few stray oak seedlings down here. So about 5 years, all of the berry brush and the hazelnut that you can see will be growing up with the aspen. About 5 years is when it'll start getting into the happy zone for grouse chicks. And this is kind of your next area. And that's how to make this keep going. Sequential cuts every 5, 10, 15 years. trying to keep each stage of grouse habitat going. The nesting habitat for the hens, the brooding or the habitat for the chicks, the habitat for the adults in winter. So that's essentially this property. So one last aspect that I'm going to mention about grouse natural history would be that males use these drumming logs for their courtship displays. And what a drumming log is essentially is a log broken off or intentionally placed, and we do make a fair number of these intentionally. And ideally it's surrounded by a lot of this escape cover. So it's in a condition where the males can come in, they are reasonably protected from avian predators, because functionally they are, sounding off to show off for the female grouse. But the reality is they are also showing off for every avian predator in the surrounding area. And so some of this escape cover next to this reduces their depredation. And these logs are at ground level. They're pretty selective on them. And they, if given a choice, once they find a collection of logs that they like to utilize, their range in breeding season may well be an acre. They stay relatively loyal to those areas. They'll span out more in winter when the food resources are more limiting. But in their breeding season, they will stay within about an acre surrounding a couple of good drumming logs. And so these are pretty important. These can be either trees that were left on site that then are felled at a later time, or they can be ones that are labeled to be left as coarsewoody debris on the site. It really depends on the logger you're dealing with and the logging job. But they don't have to be fancy. Ideally, they are some of the worst logs that you have available in the area. So ones that don't have a lot of economic value, but do have a fair amount of value for these birds, as well as for future coarsewoody debris for other reasons as well on the site besides just the grouse. And those are drumming logs. If you're a grouse, you go through winter and it's actually a pretty rough time. It's cold. You're losing a lot of energy just through metabolism. And you're not so much trying to gain energy through food during winter. You're just basically trying to stave off your loss of fat. So ideally, they come into late fall with pretty good nutritional conditions. And then in winter, they kind of hold static by eating these things. So we got a number of things here. We got catkins off of hazelnut. We got catkins off of birch. They have a real strong affinity for these birch catkins. And then you got aspen buds. And that's pretty much what they subsist on all winter long. It's ideally why you have a snow cover for them to snow roost under. Because without the ability to snow roost, they are burning 3 times, 4 times as much fat. And what that means is that they're basically losing condition on a day-by-day basis. So for a grouse, that's pretty much what you see every day, all winter long. So we're at the YMCA camp, Glacier Hollow. And this is about a 100-acre facility, and during 2019 was subjected to a pretty significant windstorm event. And that windstorm event across the state of Wisconsin took down approximately 5 million cords of timber, a significant amount of timber, and this was part of it. And that was the initiating event that started the management on this property. So this property really had not had much management as far as for the timber since the 1970s. And so it had accumulated a lot of the issues that happen when you don't do too much timber management for that many years. And so we're standing in some pretty amazing white pine. And the problem that this white pine had is that it was composed of about 50% structurally unstable trees. And what that translated to is a stand that was just waiting for a windstorm event to come through. And so part of them failed, part of them didn't, and the ones that did not fail, it was obvious that they are on the path to having failure. So a salvage logger started cutting on the property, just doing salvage. And communication with the manager of the property, we discussed marking it, and I developed a restoration plan for the whole property for her. The purpose of the restoration plan was to promote long-lived trees, to promote structural diversity, so increasing structural diversity across what is at this point a single-age stand, and to try to get regeneration of native species back to control the invasive species on the site, and through time to create a matrix of habitats across the property. And so in fall 2019, we marked this with the Silviculture class as part of their training. And they've marked it according to the plan I developed for the property. And from that point until late spring, this site was being cut. So this just got completed spring 2020. And so it's at the end of its first growing season after harvest. And so this site's relatively freshly harvested. We have represented across the property coppice for Bigtooth aspen. We have group selection trying to promote maple, pine, and oak. We have shelterwood trying to promote oak. And then we have thinning. And around the buildings, like this stand that you're looking at right now is, we're trying mostly just to promote building safety. So any of the structurally unstable trees that had potential of falling on the buildings in this area were removed, and structurally stable long-lived species were promoted. So we released a lot of white pine crop trees in this area. And that's the overall plan for the property. So in the storm damage, this area that you're looking at right here was particularly heavily hit. Most of these trees were either at a 45-degree angle from vertical, or were actually laying on the ground. And so this was salvage harvested. And the thing you can notice, this is aspen growth in 1 year. They did this since this spring. So they're capable of some pretty amazing growth. You'll see the average ones in here are probably about 6 foot tall. They'll be browsed down to about here by the end of winter by deer. They'll do another year where they'll grow up another 5 or 6 feet. And usually after 3 years, unless the deer browse is really heavy, that'll actually be enough to get them past the deer. The thing that you'll notice on this site is you've already got some brambles growing in the understory. That's a lot of the reddish stems you see there. The combination of those brambles plus this aspen, at about 5 years, when these aspen have started to close their crown and these brambles have really invaded, will be when this does become heavily utilized grouse habitat, particularly for hens with chicks. And it butts up against the hillside, which was a combination of thinned oak and shelterwood, and we'll see that in a bit. So as I had said, this property had a lot of storm damage. And if you look in this area, the area right behind me was mostly aspen. And the area lower part was actually heavily red maple. Well, the red maple had a ton of storm damage and so made mostly a pocket on its own. And this hillside was already aspen, which was partially leaning and partially stable. And so as a consequence, cutting the aspen on the hillside as well as cutting into the pocket of storm damage at the bottom is going to give us a nice area coppice. And we feathered that into a shelterwood right adjacent to it. And so the idea behind this is we're going from overstory removal to an area that's more open. You'll get a mix of age groups, to an area behind it that was just thinned. And this is going to take about 3 to 5 years before it is completely filled. You can already see the red maples and the aspens filling in. It's not going to take a terrible amount of time before it is actually really good grouse habitat, and until it is basically pretty visually appealing. And that's this part of the property. I will say this was one of the most difficult portions of the property for cutting, because it was low value material on a very steep hillside. The aspen is basically a pulp species, and it was low value that had to be cut off of a pretty steep hillside, physically making it happen somewhat difficult. Now, as far as things I see that are beneficial here, a few things. If I look right in the immediate area, I see a mix of species coming in. I see some oaks from stump sprouts. I see red maple from stump sprouts. And I see quite a number of aspen sprouts. And so when this grows up, those are going to grow up together. The aspen will outgrow the maple and the oak. But if you look at it long-term for management, in 40 years, the aspen can be cut again with individual reserve trees of those oaks or those maples. I also notice a bunch of berry brush on the ground, blackberries and dewberries, particularly in this spot. And those make that two-story habitat that grouse just love. So this is, for wildlife, this is pretty incredible habitat. So this is up on the top of the hill at the Glacier Hollow YMCA camp. And kind of going to walk you through what I did here. So you notice that the trees are marked in green for reserve. So this is a shelterwood right where we're at. You'll notice the red line boundary. I do my red lines as functionally an H. A line on one side of the tree, a line on the other, a connector between, because a logger coming through can follow that line around the edge of the area, and they're always seeing the line facing them on the edge of the tree. So there's no confusion as to where the boundary is that they're supposed to be going to. I reserved almost exclusively white oak in this area. Now the thing you notice the berry brush coming in. I'm real fond of this berry brush, particularly like it when it's blackberry. It provides a natural protection. So I've got my overstory in here of white oak. It's about a 50% level of crown retention. I've got some hazelnut in here, which is good for wildlife, hard mass producer. I've got cherries resprouting, and I've got some little baby oaks in the understory. Now this right here is nested in a broader part of the property. As we continue, if you look further over that way, you're going to see that the property was just thinned. So it was not shelter wooded over there. As we continue around, you'll notice the shelter wood extends over to the edge there where you get into some natural white pine regeneration. This is the back slope. This goes down. The hillside was thinned. At the bottom was where the aspen coppice that you saw earlier was. As you continue around, you see more thinning behind you. So the way to look at this is as if this thing is nested as a part of this overall property on top, but most of it's thinned, not shelter wooded. If you then push this through time, let's add another 10 years, this will be adequately regenerated most likely, that you can pull most of the residual trees out of here. You may choose to leave a few for structure, and you can then do a shelter wood further over that way. And you can continue doing that every 15 years until eventually this whole overstory is converted, and you've basically changed the site from a single cohort to multiple cohort. Now this property, particularly this area, had quite a bit of oak wilt. You notice that in here is 100% retention within this area of white oak. That was the target species for retention. And as you get into the thinned area, you have other species. You have the maples as well as some of the black oak and red oak. And those are being kept because they're basically outside of where the main oak wilt was. So through time, as this grows, you get another age group in the stand. And essentially I'm targeting long-term 4 or 5 age groups up here. Essentially what is being started right now and subsequent releases with Shelterwoods through time. So as part of the whole project that was going on here, we did about a 3-acre savanna restoration on this Minister Lake property. And as kind of background on this particular property, the minister's house used to be located back there 70 some odd years ago. And after it burnt, the surrounding area was planted to red pine. It was planted at a really tight spacing, 4 by 6. And it basically was not thinned for 57 years. So about 12 years ago, I thinned it the first time with a group of students called Pulp Cut. Pulp Cut is a chainsaw training program that we utilize. And then we thinned it a second time about 5 years ago. Now this portion, this central part, was a sea of invasive woody shrubs, a sea of box elder. So box elder is a lowland species here that's expanded to the uplands as an invasive. Buckthorn, autumn olive, barberry, and with an understory of poison ivy. And by that I'm talking a continuous stand of almost 100% poison ivy on the ground. It was not really a very pleasant place to be. Has since had all of that cut, and it has been herbicided repeatedly until the poison ivy went into oblivion. And it was rotary seeded to a mix of worm season grasses as well as forbs and legumes. And this is the end of the 3rd growing season after it was done. And now, this coming spring, barring COVID restrictions, we should be out here with fire crew doing a burn on this, its first burn. And from that point on, you're going to have a continued improvement of species composition. You're still going to see some box elder sprouting. Many of these have been herbicided, but box elder is very resistant to dying that way. And so after the fire, the resprouts will be spot treated. And hopefully through time, the box elder is going to disappear. There's a pocket of aspen towards the entrance that's going to continue to increase. And hopefully through time, you'll get much more diversity. Really all you're going to need in here is just regular fire. And that's a part of the overall program where we have students trained in prescribed burning. So it's actually going to be a nice component for them. So what we got right here is a pocket that's a little bit over 100-foot drip line to drip line that we cut out for Bigtooth aspen. So quaking aspen, you really need a pocket to be about 2 acres minimum for it to be successful. Bigtooth is a little bit more shade tolerant than quaking aspen. It's still a very intolerant species. But about 100-foot drip line to drip line is usually enough to where they can actually successfully start a pocket. And what you see in my hand here is Bigtooth, and if you look through the area behind it, you'll see other Bigtooth in there. And you'll notice a lot of the bramble. We got blackberry and we got black raspberry as well as some red raspberry. But mostly blackberry and black raspberry. This is what really is the start of very wonderful grouse habitat. The chicks utilize this basically as soon as the grouse hens are off the nest. They take their chicks to this kind of habitat because as this Bigtooth gets bigger, you're going to get closure over top, and then you're going to get this bramble layers underneath. And so it is a perfect escape cover for the chicks, and it's also a good foraging cover for them. So for this is about as good as you're going to get for young chick habitat. Add probably out to about another 10 or 15 years. At about 10 or 15, this is going to start declining for chick habitat, but temporarily it'll be good. In 10 years, we're going to be back in this, and we'll enlarge this pocket. So it'll essentially be expanding gap. This is going to get the Bigtooth established. There was a few mature Bigtooth aspen here before we cut it. They've started growing. Once we get this pocket established, in 10 years, we'll cut a circle another 60 feet or so out in all directions, meaning we'll get a bigger pocket of Bigtooth aspen, meaning we'll get more grouse habitat, and we'll be able to do it in a much less visually intrusive way. So this is one of my favorite spots on the whole property. This is going to be our long rotation white pine area. This had not actually been thinned until we thinned this several years ago. And so it had gone for probably 100 years, no thinning. And what you'll notice if you look into the crown is there's still a lot of trees left here with very small crowns. And my reasoning for this is this: you really couldn't thin this all the way to where you want it to be permanently, simply because the trees had grown for 100 years under very, very full stocking conditions. White pine has a tendency to stack up a lot of trees. What you can do is come in and thin it, get it prepared, let it grow for 10 years, and then come back and set it to a more permanent trajectory. My intent, assuming they keep with the same management plan on this after I retire, is for this to be, held out to 150 to 180 years old. It's in the ideal location on the property for this. This is a north-facing slope, so it's moister, it's cooler, and it has a little bit better soil conditions. So what you have is the ability for these trees to go for a longer period of time. It's also not terribly accessible. It's reasonably steep, and so it can be entered a couple of times, but ideally it would be really a part of the property just to thin, get ready, and then allow it to go for another 50 to 80 years. And so that is this property, this part of the property, long rotation white pine. Okay, for some overall background, this is the Minister Lake property. This is owned by University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point Foundation and is directly adjacent to the Central Wisconsin Environmental Station. Central Wisconsin Environmental Station was hoping to have a timber sale, and part of that was to put it all into basically restoration forestry. The area around the buildings, those areas, their intent was to essentially go through and remove hazard and risk trees. So for around the buildings, the treatment was really just to reduce risk. Once you get away from the buildings, you had opportunities to go to much different directions. And so some of the main goals we had for it, basically to promote long-lived species. On this site, things like white oak and white pine are long-lived species. To transition to, in areas, have a complete natural regeneration of native species. To increase structural diversity, so to have big individual trees, but also a wide range of age groups. To promote Bigtooth aspen where possible, because Bigtooth aspen is a shorter lived species in the lake states, but is extremely important for wildlife. To promote snags and coarse woody debris where it did not interfere with the structure. So as long as we're away from the buildings, snags and coarse woody debris are a main goal for the property. Near the buildings, we don't want that because of the risk to the structures. And what that translated to is a creation of a much, much higher structural diversity property than what was here before. When we first started on this, most everything was even age. At this point, we're starting the first steps of converting it to, at a landscape basis, uneven age. Now, we're not looking at conventional uneven age management here. each of the pockets we're working in are actually going to be even age pockets. But at a landscape level, a lot of structural diversity and a very uneven age condition at a landscape basis. Even though at an individual stand or pocket basis, it's going to be even age. And that's kind of the first stage we're at right now. We're 5 years into this process. It's essentially been cut. It's been partially planted, and through the rest of this video, you'll see what it looks like. So this is generally an ephemeral wetland. And the reason I'm saying generally is that for the last 3 years, Wisconsin, central Wisconsin, has had an awful lot of rain, significantly more than normal. And what you'll notice is that trees that are, out to 80 plus years old in here are actually buried underwater right now. And so that's going to be a good opportunity for recruitment of both coarsewoody debris and snags long term. These ephemeral wetlands in Wisconsin play a really pretty pivotal role for waterfowl. A number of species of waterfowl utilize these in spring essentially to fatten up. They come into the area. There are a lot of, depending on which ones you're in, some will be isopods, other ones will be fairy shrimp. And those, they have a lot of fat, a fair amount of protein, and those are used to generate the body mass that's needed for these animals to basically have their nests. And so they lay the eggs. They are literally turning the fat and protein from the fairy shrimp and from the isopods into duck eggs. And for certain species, these are important enough that it basically, if they don't have that, they are not able to successfully nest, or if they lose their first nest, they have so little body condition left that they don't really have the ability to effectively second nest. So these are quite important regionally. Now, the impact of the last 3 years, I have no clue what to say on that. This has been a really odd 3 years with the amount of rain we've had. Long term, these will go down and go back up. The nature of these drying out is pretty important for the organisms using them. Fairy shrimp really can't succeed without the wetland drying out during the year. The eggs actually have to dry out or they don't successfully hatch. So you end up with these, they've been wet. This wetland never connected to the adjacent lake. Now it does. That allows predators that would normally not be present to be able to come in. It changes the whole ecosystem. But overall, these are really important to the success of wildlife in this region. So this side of the property, the Central Wisconsin Environmental side, station side north of the lake, is set up as a habitat management zone. And what we've done is throughout central Wisconsin, as well as other parts of Wisconsin, it goes all the way up into the far north eastern portion of Wisconsin, all the way to nearly the Minnesota border. We've set up demonstration plots on how to manage sites using timber harvest, but where your main goal is not necessarily generating profit from the timber, although you do generate money from the timber. The goal is instead to generate habitat for various wildlife species, both game species and non-game species. And so this one is part of a project where we're looking at taking managed forest law, which is a tax incentive program for forestry in Wisconsin, and deer management assistance program, the DMAP program, and interacting those two activities in a way to favor wildlife on private landowners' properties. Across Wisconsin, 80% of private landowners own their property with wildlife as at least one of their main goals for their property, and that's either non-consumptive or consumptive use. So in this property, the things that we've done to optimize for wildlife habitat, about 20% of the property is in overstory removal. So we went in, and in places where we either had bigtooth aspen or existing regeneration, we took the overstory off. usually in relatively small pockets, anywhere from 2 acres down to significantly smaller. About 20% of the property was in shelterwood conditions, where we did about 50% crown closure with the idea of getting light to the ground and getting the next cohort of regeneration going. And then the rest of it was essentially thinned. What's nice about that is that every 10 to 15 years, you can continue doing that same entry where you go in and remove the overstory off of 20% of the property, shelterwood 20%, then the matrix. You can do that essentially forever. By the time you get to the end of a rotation, you're actually to the start of a rotation on other parts of the property. It's actually a magical system. It works really, really well for landowners that are trying to manage for wildlife, because many of our species are edge species that are game species in Wisconsin. Now, if you look behind me, you're going to see the thinned matrix. A little bit further back, you're going to see coppice. As we walk around, we're going to come through a lot of interesting other features here. You're going to notice that we have planted forbs. This hillside was basically extremely sandy. The site index on this hillside for those red pine is about 35. It's really actually quite low. That's 35 on a 50-year basis. So very low, very sandy soil. Has a lot of neat benefits. We have a Barrens type in Wisconsin, and the Barrens type is essentially a sandy, low nutrient condition, but we have a lot of really unique plant species. And so we've seeded some of those. For example, lupin for Karner blue butterfly, as well as some others you can see like black-eyed Susan, bergamot, and various grass species. That hillside over there is also heavily utilized by turtles. So it's sandy, gravelly, very, very, very coarse soil. And the turtles essentially walk up the hills from the lakes that are in the surrounding area and utilize that hillside for nesting. And that's part of it, looking at what you have available, like this little pocket right here, and managing for that. And looking around at the rest of the habitat and seeing places where you can do an overstory removal and get successful regeneration. Places where shelterwood makes sense, and then places where it just should be thinned. And what it ends up being is a very aesthetically pleasing property as well. So I'm going to start on this by talking about this particular pocket. So bigtooth aspen is an important species in Wisconsin for wildlife. It's used extensively for forage for the leaves and the growing shoots. And then after it gets quite a bit larger, it's fed on by grouse in winter. That's usually when it's 30 years old and older. So this is a 2-year-old aspen sprout. And if you can look, you'll see quite a bit more of them here. This happens to be closest. What this was done was this was basically cut of all trees. We used the area to the right as a decking location for our wood. And then I came in afterwards, and all of the disturbed area I rotary seeded. And some of the materials I rotary seeded were warm and cool season grasses. So some of the warm season grasses would have included big blue stem, Indian grass, and little blue stem. And some of the cool season grasses would have included, for example, Canada wild rye. There was also included a mix of forbs and legumes, and those were there to act as a forage for various birds particularly. And through time, this area is going to regenerate, and in 10 years the aspen will be what's dominating. But in the meantime, that grass cover will keep the invasives that frequently landings are a location where invasive species come into a site. Those invasive species will be held partly at bay by having a very aggressive cover on the landing. Into the future, when we come back in to log this site again in, let's say, 10 years, what we'll end up doing is expanding these pockets where the bigtooth aspen is to enlarge the bigtooth. but you're also going to end up redisturbing the site. What'll be nice about that is at that point in time, we'll have an established grass cover with existing rhizomes, but also seed for disturbance-mediated forbs and legumes. So the places where you have the disturbance, the forbs and legumes will dominate. The places that you have the established grass that hasn't been disturbed will go back into the grasses. So it's actually a nice long-term cover to happen in these much more open areas. Through time, I would expect this to become mostly bigtooth aspen in this pocket. But if you look at the surrounding area, the thing you're going to notice is you have some very mature pine. With the lake behind us, we actually preserved quite a distance to the lake to basically without stand entry. We have a primitive campsite that's utilized right down by the lake, and we want to keep it quite aesthetically pleasing. We have a hillside behind here that was managed to promote a long rotation white pine, so it was thinned. And if you notice the coarse woody debris, this was intentional. The loggers' instructions were when they had material at the tops of the trees that was not particularly high value, that should be left for coarse woody debris. We essentially want to create drumming logs for grouse at the edges of these coppice areas, so that the grouse can come in and utilize them for their mating displays. And that's this pocket. Okay, so regarding the restoration on this site, a lot of the work has been done in collaboration with students and classes. So my silviculture class, we used some of the timber that was felled for merchandising activities to talk about log quality and volumes. My Society of Ecological Restoration students were out here. They assisted with some of the cutting and brush piling. U.S. Fish and Wildlife did quite a bit of cutting, as did contractors. Our fire crew, who are people that are trained with U.S. Forest Service certs, did brush pile burns, as well as a burn in the area directly behind the camera. The targets when this was marked, so this was marked with the class using restoration techniques. That's the name of the course. And when it was marked with students as part of their training, and their goals were to release white oak crop trees and white pine crop trees when given an opportunity, and to shoot from a low of 2 trees per acre to a high of 50% crown closure, with the target of 50% crown closure to be the furthest away from the oak wilt infestation. So where you're standing, where this camera is right now, is basically the main area of oak wilt infestation. So the further you go away, the higher the basal area is that remains. For seeding mixes, this is going to be allowed to resprout over summer. We'll burn the brush piles this coming spring. It'll resprout over summer. We'll come in and spray twice with herbicide. And then in fall, we're going to seed with a mix of grasses, forbs, and legumes. Now regionally, we have a federally endangered species called Karner blue butterfly. One of the things that's going to be included within this seeding mix is lupin. Lupin is the basically main food, well, the only food source for the larvae. And then for the adults, they use a broad mix of forbs and legumes as nectar sources. And so this is going to be seeded with lupin as well as grasses, and then forbs and legumes that'll act as nectar sources. So there'll be quite a bit of opportunity for butterfly species, numerous of which are endangered species in this region, and then also other bird species. A lot of Schmeekly is relatively closed forest. Once this has been opened up like this, it's going to allow other species that have normally not persisted here to actually utilize the sites. As far as for the students, this becomes a main benefit because one of the goals is to have represented within this reserve all of the main ecosystems that we have possible in this region. And this gives us yet another one of them, savanna conditions, for these students to essentially be able to utilize. So walking through this site, I guess the bigger issues are what are you going to need to do into the future to keep this functional. So at this stage, we've gone through, we've marked the site. We've done the cutting of the site. This was done, like I said, in large part with students, with volunteers, with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and some contractors. And then we'll do the initial preparation of the site, the burning of the site, the mulching of the site, which is going to be done with a forestry mulching unit, and finally the seeding. But the thing that becomes the real problem on these sites is maintaining them into the future. And we're going to put a regular burn cycle into this site is one of the main things that's going to be necessary to keep this functioning. This is nested within an area that has quite a lot of invasive species. And you have anything from buckthorn, which is one of our most problematic invasive species, but then a whole range of herbaceous ones. Garlic mustard, crown vetch, there's quite a number of plants that are on this property. Burn cycle of anywhere from every year to every 5 years is really what's going to be needed to actually keep this thing perpetually in a savanna condition. And the shorter length of time will be more favoring the grasses, the longer length of time would be more favoring a little more of the shrub species. So that's really the main thing, fire, and then possibly long-term some spot spraying for controlling invasives would be the main long-term maintenance needed for this site. And you may get some oak wilt expansion, so there may be some need to remove some individual trees to try to reduce the spread. I'm hoping that at this point this is actually going to, well, at least within this portion of the property, going to stop the spread of oak wilt. Okay, so none of this could happen without the machinery, and so we'll start with the first thing was just chainsaws. This was hand cut, so none of this was done mechanically for felling the trees. It was all cut by hand. A lot of the initial piling was done by hand for the brush piles, but then also using skid steers. And then we had forestry mulching, so the area that I'm standing in right now is post-forestry mulching, essentially a skid steer with a masticator head on it. And then later we'll be coming in with four-wheelers with a sprayer behind them to do the spraying. And finally, we're going to be using, just for the follow-up, it'll be small tractor with the seeder behind it. This is being set up so that it can actually be done with a seeding drill, which is part of the reason we are cleaning it up so good, simply because that's the best way to get the seed soil contact. Follow-up, be using equipment that has sprayers on it for putting out fires, so we would have various forms of four-wheelers and off-road vehicles with water tanks, drip torches, and that's pretty much it. That's the basic equipment that we would use on this site. So, looking at this and considering some of the habitat elements, savanna is a really unique environmental condition. You have enough trees that it's altering the microsites, so you're actually getting a wide range of variability in the plant materials that grow on the site. Anything from plants that require shade to plants that are really more open land type species. And so you get a wide range of site conditions. This is going to be seeded with a mix that includes grasses, but is actually dominated more heavily by forbs and legumes. A lot of the grasses that are planted on these sites are extremely aggressive grasses, and the problem you run into with that is you get a very homogeneous site with mostly grasses if you're too heavily based on grasses in your seedings. Many of the forbs and legumes are much more weak in their early establishment, so this is going to be a little bit more heavy in the grasses, in the forbs and legumes on this site. Now, I'd mentioned Karner blue butterfly. That being federally endangered species has been subject to a lot of work across Wisconsin. And Wisconsin's been pretty successful in the restoration for that species. It is a really good indicator species for successful barrens and savannas. And the reason it is that the larvae require lupin, which is a disturbance species. In order for the lupin to stay in the site effectively, it has to have regular disturbance. And that's intrinsic to savannas. That's why they stay savannas. The adults need a wide mix of forbs and lagoons to get nectar off of. So you need both, and what that means, anytime you've got that high diversity of nectar species that last during the whole season, and you also have the disturbance system that you need in place for the lupin, it means you've actually got a very functioning savanna ecosystem. So it's not only an endangered species, but it's also an organism that carries a lot of what it means to be a savanna with its requirements. So that's what we're hoping with this. Long term, this site will be a nice resource for the students. It'll be a nice resource for the wildlife. And frankly, it's going to be beautiful once it's done. So aesthetically, it's going to be an amazing resource. So I guess this part of it is when I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact of the surrounding community and stakeholders. So if you were to look at this is along the Green Circle Trail, which is a 20-some mile long trail in Stevens Point. This is a very heavily utilized portion of the reserve. And so this is visually intrusive, what we're doing right here. And so we put up signage while we're through here that explains what we're doing, because part of the social contract with this is if you are going to be making it ugly for a period of time, there has to be a reason behind why you're doing it. And it's nested within an overall restoration plan for the whole property. So the entirety of this reserve is actually under a long-term restoration plan. This is one of the higher focal areas, just simply because of the importance of dealing with the oak wilt. And so we have stakeholder groups that include students. Well, this is going to benefit students because it gives them another ecosystem to work with. We have local community users. There are runners that use these sites just for cross-country running or for jogging, etc. A lot of families use this site, and in most cases, once they're aware that there's an oak wilt problem, and this is being done in part to deal with oak wilt and in part to keep with the restoration plan for the property, you get a lot more public support for the activity. Volunteers that we've had out here have included people like the Friends of Schmeekley. Friends of Schmeekley Reserve are a friends group that they both volunteered money and time to this project. They're out here today, for example, assisting with some removal of branches on logs. This particular site's had student groups involved, it's had students involved in classes, and it's had contractors as well. And so that involvement of stakeholders in this is pretty much imperative to make it successful within the community. It's not just that the restoration is successful, it's that the people know why it's happening and that they think it should happen as well. I will say that it's going to be 2 years that it is going to look a little visually rough. And after that, it's going to start looking amazing. About 3 to 4 years out, it'll be basically a developed system. But in that interim, people need to know why it's happening.